Okay, so Bismillah Rahman Rahim. So today we'll be starting with guidelines for the diagnosis and treatment of cobalamin and folate disorders. So in summary, I think I'll just go across this annotation. The summary is basically just the clinical that the clinical picture is the most important factor in assessing the significance of test results, assessing cobalamin status. I just wanted to take a quick check. Is my screen visible and is my voice audible to all of you? Well, so fine. I think we'll just then move on. The summary of clinical key recommendations states that the clinical picture is the most important factor in assessing the significance of test results, assessing cobalamin status, because there is no gold standard test to define the deficiency. So each of these deficiencies, that is the co- uh, cobalamin and the folate disorders, both of them, they do not there is no such gold standard test to define the deficiency. Therefore, most of the clinical picture is the most important factor. So, therefore, history taking would be most important in the is the first line in the diagnosis. And then the in the test, the serum cobalamin currently remains the first line test with the additional second line plasma methyl malonic acid to help clarify uncertainties of underlying biochemical functional deficiencies. And then the third in line is the serum holotranscobalamin level, which has the potential as a first line test, but an indeterminate gray area may still exist. So plasma homocysteine, therefore, may be helpful as a second line test, but is less specific than methyl malonic acid. So we have all these tests that they have mentioned over here. That is first of all, the serum cobalamin level, which we know to be the main test that we prescribe all patients. And also, apart from the cobalamin, we can also go for holotranscobalamin. This has the potential to be as listed as the first line test, but there is an indeterminate gray area in which these levels cannot be cannot determine positivity or negativity. And I think we'll go into detail about those in just a minute. And so the second line are then the so basically first line are just the cobalamin and the holotranscobalamin levels, because holotranscobalamin levels will be in a way affected by by factors that affect protein synthesis as well, because this is also going to be a transport protein for the for the transfer cobalamin. So apart from this, a second line test would then be would then indirectly measure cobalamin levels based on the accumulation of byproducts. So the second line test could be methyl malonic acid levels and also homocysteine levels. So methyl malonic acid and homocysteine are these are the substrates for cobalamin, that is methyl malonic malonyl CoA is converted to succinyl CoA by the enzyme adenosyl cobalamin, so which is a form of it is an intra mitochondrial form of cobalamin. So methyl malonyl CoA is converted to succinyl CoA. So in the absence of cobalamin, there would be an increase of methyl malonic acid. And also another substrate that is that accumulates is homocysteine, which is converted to methionine by methyl cobalamin, the famous reaction that we know of methylation, in which homocysteine is converted to methionine. So there are two conversions: homocysteine to methionine by methyl cobalamin, and methyl malonyl CoA to succinyl CoA by adenosyl cobalamin. So the levels of these two enzymes the level of the deficiency of cobalamin can therefore then determine the can cause defects in the can actually raise levels of methylmalonic acid, because these are the substrates on which the enzyme acts. So the level would be raised in cases of deficiency. There is a serum cobalamin, and also a new sort of a potential first line test is the holotranscobalamin. But of course, it has not replaced serum cobalamin level as yet, because there are certain indeterminate green zones that still exist. Now, definitive cutoff points to define. So then they have actually stated the names of the tests, and then they go on to describe the different. Um, I'm just going through the messages. Is my voice clear to each one of you? Because it was just a message that someone could not hear me. If there's any sort of a discrepancy, you can just mention that in the chat box, because I'll be looking that up also side by side. So anyway, we just continue. So these are the tests that need to be done, and then also the definitive cutoff points to define the clinical and subclinical deficiency are not they are not possible, because there is no definite cutoff point. So there are just certain post cutoff points and a lot of gray zones in between. So given the variety of methodologies used and the technical issues and the local reference ranges being used to establish the deficiency levels, so there's so much variation in the methodologies that are used and the technical agents and the reagents that are used, that it is not possible to have a well-defined cutoff. So I think all labs would then we'd actually, whenever we determine cobalamin deficiency, there are certain ranges that we come across, but each lab will have their own specific set of ranges. So in the presence of discordance between the test result and the strong clinical features of deficiency, treatment should not be delayed to avoid neurological impairment. And treatment of cobalamin deficiency is recommended in line with the British National Formulary, and oral therapy must be suitable and acceptable, provided appropriate doses are taken and compliance is not an issue. And serum folate, and so for cobalamin we have all these like four tests that they have mentioned in the summary, and for folate we have this serum folate levels that are done, and along with that they offer equivalent diagnostic capability to red cell folate. So there is just two tests for folate: serum folate and red cell folate. And the first line is of course the serum folate, but the red cell folate is also complementary to that, and so its values are also well documented to be diagnostic for deficiency. So first of all, we'll just go through the cobalamin deficiency as a whole, and then we'll discuss the treatment, also the causes and the treatment of cobalamin in the beginning. So in patients with classical megaloblastic anemia, the presence of a low serum cobalamin level and objective assessment of response in terms of the rise in hemoglobin concentration clearly outlines the treatment pathway. However, the majority of patients do not have such a clear-cut picture. So, in patients with classical megaloblastic anemia, the presence of a low serum cobalamin level and the objective assessment of response in terms of the rise in hemoglobin concentration clearly outlines the treatment pathway. However, the majority do not have a clear-cut picture. Neurological presentation, that is peripheral neuropathy and subacute combined degeneration of the cord. So, the most striking is that is the manifestation, the clinical picture that we look for in cases of cobalamin is the neuropathy and the subacute combined degeneration of the spinal cord. They may occur in the absence of hematological changes. So basically the anemia, the classical anemia that we are looking for, it may not be there in whereas the clinical features of peripheral neuropathy and subacute combined degeneration may be the first presenting when the early first changes. And early treatment is essential to avoid the permanent neurological damage. So this is one of the key features that we need to take into account when we are treating them, that cobalamin deficiency, although it because this cobalamin is the levels of this B12, they remain stable for quite some time. So we do not, whenever there is a deficiency, that we need to take into account that early treatment is needed. Otherwise this neurological deficit can become permanent, and it could be permanent neurological disability. And low cobalamin levels of certain of uncertain significance may it occur with non-specific symptoms. So they're actually outlined this even in this chart over here, that mentions the intake, the summary of the causes. So I think we'll just go through. They will discuss them briefly here as well, because they have mentioned this in the figure below. However, so anyway, those patients that we suspect to have low cobalamin level may have non-specific symptoms in the beginning, and there may be no anemia, as they have mentioned earlier. Furthermore, patients with strong clinical features of cobalamin deficiency may have serum cobalamin levels that lie within the reference range. That is, they may be false normal. So this is all the variability that they had mentioned. That is there in the lab reports of the labs, and the true clinical picture. So even if the patient has if we have a strong clinical, if they have strong clinical features of cobalamin, the values may still be lie within the reference range. And even if they have even if they show those cobalamin levels, sometimes they may not show those specific symptoms, or they may not even show the anemia. So there is great variability in the clinical picture and the laboratory findings. Sometimes the laboratory findings can be suggestive and the clinical feature may not be suggestive, and sometimes it's vice versa, with the um, clinical picture being very suggestive and the laboratory findings being within the normal reference range. So as a result, other tests may be used to try and determine an underlying functional or biochemical deficiency. These tests, the plasma homocysteine, so these are the tests that we were referring to earlier, the homocysteine, methylmalonic acid, and the serum holotranscobalamin levels. They may help but are not widely available currently, and the cutoff points to indicate the deficiency vary between different laboratories. So in addition, their role is not clearly defined in the routine diagnostic setting. Therefore, there is a current no gold standard test for the diagnosis of cobalamin deficiency. Given that the biochemical pathways of cobalamin and folate are closely intertwined, the patients with patients showing similar features for both, so assessment of cobalamin and folate status is usually performed concurrently. So, and in the presence of true cobalamin deficiency, the serum folate is often normal. Okay, so this is also one other a sort of a pitfall in the diagnosis that can occur, that not only the clinical and the biochemical picture may not correlate with each other, but also the combined deficiency of both the folate and because of the biochemically linked pathways of cobalamin and folate, the assessment of cobalamin and folate is usually performed concurrently. So this is something that we need to take into account. That is, in the presence of and this is one another thing, that in the presence of true cobalamin deficiency, serum folate is often normal or can be elevated. So in this is also another hint. So if there is true cobalamin deficiency, so even if our lab values may not indicate this as such, but so not only do we need to do the serum cobalamin levels, but we also need to do the serum folate levels, because they may be sometimes they may be normal or they may be elevated. In folate deficiency, however, the cobalamin levels would also be low. However, in cobalamin deficiency, this is sort of some correlation between these two values that they will probably go into detail in afterwards. But the thing is that when folate is low, cobalamin is mostly also low, except for in certain in very rare conditions. And apart from that, in true cobalamin deficiency, the serum folate is often normal or can be elevated, which is because of the folate trapping. So, however, a low serum cobalamin level may be found in the presence of folate deficiency. So wherever there is folate deficiency, there is usually a low serum cobalamin level, but this is not the case with true cobalamin deficiency, where it can be normal and it can be elevated even. So now the test to diagnose, test to confirm the diagnosis of cobalamin. So what will they be? Basically, we'll start from the very beginning. That is first the CBC and then the peripheral smear. So there is identification of hypersegmented neutrophils. That is those with more than 5% of neutrophils with more than 5 or more lobes. So more than 5% neutrophils with 5 or more lobes. So they have to be more than equal to 5 lobes in the that's hyperlobated, and presence of oval macrocytes. This is the classical picture that we consider for megaloblastic anemia. This may suggest either cobalamin or folate deficiency. But this is characteristic for megaloblastic anemia, and therefore it is not very specific for cobalamin. So this is when we find a picture of hyper segmented neutrophils and oval macrocytes, the diagnosis is most likely megaloblastic anemia, but it may be folate or cobalamin. So at that level, we do not know much. We cannot be these cannot be very sensitive in early cobalamin deficiency, and are not specific for it also. In oval macrocytes, those are the hyper-segmented neutrophils, and the circulating megaloblasts in the blood film and megaloblastic changes in the bone marrow are the typical findings of clinical cobalamin deficiency. However, an elevated mean cell volume is not a specific indicator of cobalamin deficiency. So MCV elevation is not a specific indicator, and the possibility of underlying myelodysplastic syndrome has to be considered. So in myelodysplastic syndrome also, the B12 deficiency is one of the key causes of macrocytosis and abnormal peripheral blood findings of RBCs and dysplasia. So we have to exclude B12 deficiency and alcohol excess and drugs as causes of. So whenever we come across any sort of value, whenever we come across raised MCV, we need to exclude not only this megaloblastic anemia, but also myelodysplastic anemia and alcoholism, and also drugs. Certain drugs may also lead cause raised MCV, and which are of course those drugs which interfere with folate and B12 metabolism either directly or indirectly. And the absence of a raised MCV cannot be used to exclude the need for cobalamin testing, because neurological impairment occurs with a normal seizure. So this is another sort of a pitfall in the diagnosis that we need to take into account. That is, if there's a normal MCV, we do not exclude cobalamin deficiency. So that is why most of the cases that we come across, when they show anemia and there are signs of neurological deficit, even without with the hypochromic or probably normocytic anemia, we cannot exclude the causes of cobalamin deficiency. Because there could be, we actually label them as combined deficiency, maybe iron and B12 folate combined deficiency. So for those cases, we need to take into account, we need to still get the cobalamin testing done if there's a neurological impairment and clinical suspicion is strong. And the serum cobalamin assay is currently the standard initial routine diagnostic test. It quantifies both the inactive forms, that is the transcobalamin 1 and 3, the bound, now referred to as the hollow heptocorin, and the active form. So these were the different forms of transcobalamin that are present. That is, the one in the serum is mostly the one that is transcobalamin 1 and transcobalamin 3. Transcobalamin 1 and is like the free form, and transcobalamin 3 is the bound form, now referred to as hollow heptocorin. So regarding this, and also the transcobalamin 2. So 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the free form, 3 is the bound form, and 2 is also the bound form, but it is known as hollow transcobalamin. So 2 and 3 are both bound forms, and 2 and 3. So they are both bound forms, and 3 is the hollow heptocorin, and 2 is the hollow transcobalamin. Both of them are labeled as they have the prefix of hollow, but the 3 is the heptocorin, and the 2 is known as the transcobalamin. So it is widely available. We can actually now refer to as this is the testing of hollow transcobalamin is also widely available also widely available and is low cost and automated method based on intrinsic factor binding of cobalamin and immune chemiluminescence based assay. However, it lacks the specificity and sensitivity required of a robust diagnostic test. So there is some sort of a reference to an appendix. Probably we'll come across that in the end. So I think before we actually skip this, we might as well go through the chart that mentions the summary of the causes of transcobalamin deficiency. There was no reference to the table one in this read through. Um, Yes, I think they just mentioned that serum. Though they just mentioned over here that all those measurements of serum folate and cobalamin form a considerable proportion of volume of testing in routine labs, and they were found with a wide spectrum of clinical conditions. So the clinical conditions that would actually prompt sort of a suspicion of cobalamin deficiency. So we'll just first of all uh, concentrate on this aspect of that is the deficiency is present in all ages and is most likely most common causes are infections, malabsorptions, and medical conditions. These would be those conditions that would affect the sort of the absorption of cobalamin. So infections like the H. pylori, Giardia lamblia, and fish tapeworm. So in this, so infections of the stomach and of the that is the and where the this cobalamin becomes bound, that is in the jejunum. So I think I'll just confirm this chart regarding cobalamin deficiency. So most of the disorders are mostly due to some gastric causes, which may be infections of the stomach, that is the H. pylori infection, or there could be also causes of gastritis like gastric resection of or for any sort of cancer or inflammation, or due to celiac, and also these intestinal causes of celiac disease and tropical sprue and Crohn's disease, which would affect the absorption part of it, because most of the absorption of the B12, it takes part in because intrinsic factor, the receptors for the intrinsic factor, they are found those when they are blocked because of because intrinsic factor secretion is by the parietal by the gastric parietal cells, and then the absorption is most likely it occurs in the ileal mucosa. So this is mostly in the ileum that the attachment of intrinsic factor occurs. So any sort of ileal disease like tropical sprue, celiac disease, and Crohn's disease, they can affect the absorption part of it. Then so either there is low intake in of cobalamin rich foods. So cobalamin rich foods are those mostly like meat. So what kind of foods do we have that which are rich in cobalamin? They are this can arise in vegans who omit meat, fish, eggs, cheese, and other animal or dairy products. Like so, meat and fish, and eggs and cheese, and other animal products from mostly dairies from their diet. So this can occur in those strict vegetarians. And however, nowadays most vegetarians are conscious about their dietary intake, and they they have found like new sources of consumption of cobalamin, mostly in the form of certain fruits and berries, because they are also very rich in B12 and folate. So therefore, it is this type of a deficiency occurs rarely now in most of the vegans even who are most educated about their diets. Our nutritional cobalamin deficiency may not progress to megaloblastic anemia because the diet is not totally lacking cobalamin. The enterohepatic circulation if it is also intact, the body losses will reduce um, the enterohepatic circulation when it is intact, so it will cause the body losses will be reduced, but as stores will diminish, so then of course as this deficiency can set in. And so mostly it occurs although it occurs in all ages, but it is most common in infants, and this is because of if the mother was also cobalamin deficient, then these infants will also develop megaloblastic anemia at about 3 to 6 months of age, since they are born with low stores of cobalamin and are then fed breastfed milk, which is also has a low cobalamin content. And but is unrecognized unrecognized maternal pernicious anemia. So even if the mother had pernicious anemia, if the mother had was also severely cobalamin deficient, then this could arise even in the child, and up till and by about 3 to 6 months of age, then this deficiency would become manifest, especially since breast milk is not only low in cobalamin in iron, but is also low in cobalamin. This occurs most commonly in vegans who are, but also in or also in those unrecognized maternal pernicious anemia, those with those that autoimmune pernicious anemia, and also in strict practitioners of veganism living in Western countries whose offsprings have shown growth retardation and psychomotor development impairment. So. So we have basically decreased dietary intake if these meat, fish, and eggs and veggies they are not included in diet, and from the mother this can pass on to the child even, which can manifest this. And there are also some like genetics. So this could be due to the maternal strict vegetarian diet, and also post weaning there could be adherence to vegan diet in the child as well. So and also there are some genetic disorders which are associated with um, this transcobalamin deficiency. That is either the transporter, the transcobalamin is deficient, or there are certain this Imerslund Grasbeck syndrome. Um, there was some reference to this also that I looked up. This Imerslund um, Grasbeck syndrome is a selective malabsorption of cobalamin with protein urea. And okay, I must as well just point out that we will come across a certain break because of the time limit of 40 minutes. So after about 10 minutes, if we will just be sticking with this chart, and we'll continue for about 5-10 minutes more. But if the connection is lost in between, please come back and rejoin. So afterwards. So regarding the genetic cause of transcobalamin, so genetic causes we have the transcobalamin deficiency as such, which is the transporter protein for cobalamin. And also there is this Imerslund Grasbeck syndrome, which is a selective malabsorption of cobalamin with protein urea. And this is a syndrome basically with the megaloblastic anemia, and it is an autosomal recessive disease and the most common cause of megaloblastic anemia due to cobalamin deficiency in the Western countries. And these familial clusters in Norway and in Middle East and Africa. So patients usually present with anemia between the age of 1 and 5 years. So we had with maternal cobalamin deficiency, the child presents earlier with about within about 3 to 6 months. Whereas those with absorption of cobalamin, they may have mothers who had probably cobalamin rich stores, and they were able to um, then the cobalamin stores of the infant were there in to overcome to get them through the 1 to 5 year through the age of 1 up till 5 years even in some cases. So like this actually shows that the if the stores are adequate, the deficiency actually sets in quite late. It may takes about some years before the deficiency set in. So if the mother was deficient, then of course the child would present very early. within about 3 to 6 months of age. But if the mother is normal, there's an autosomal recessive disorder with the infant being as the one who's severely affected by homozygous expression of this deficiency, then this anemia would develop at about 1 to 5 years of age. They secrete normal amounts of intrinsic factor and gastric acid, but there is a impaired synthesis, processing, or ligand binding of tubulin due to inherited mutation. So this is actually a tubulin receptor mutation. These receptors, that is the intrinsic factor, this selective malabsorption of cobalamin occurs because of intrinsic factor deficiency. So this is the intrinsic factor receptor deficiency. So the receptor has the parts of tubulin and amylonless. So there could be deficiencies, there could be mutations in either the tubulin part of it or inherited mutations in the uh, uh, that could affect the amnion-less, the AMN part of it. So tubulin and amnion-less mutations in the genes that form the intrinsic factor receptor. So other tests of intestinal absorption are also normal. So not only the intrinsic factor amount is secreted is normal, the gastric acid, so the secretion is also normal. The parietal cells are doing their work, but the and also the intestinal absorption of other substances is normal. It's just specifically, so in Mersland-Grasbach syndrome, there is specific intrinsic factor receptor deficiency. So the effects of intrinsic factor, so effects of cobalamin deficiency will be only there. And over 90% of these patients, because this is known as selective malabsorption of cobalamin, so there's selective malabsorption of cobalamin because of the intrinsic factor which is specific for cobalamin, and this is associated proteinuria, which is a specific proteinuria with the renal function being normal and renal biopsy otherwise not showing any consistent renal defect. So this is basically selective malabsorption of cobalamin with the non-specific protein, right? So there's no actually known. In some cases, they have shown that they could be because of certain renal congenital renal abnormalities with the amino acid urea and others, but the main cause is not known. So it could be either the transporter defect or the receptor defect. So there could be transcobalamin deficiency or a Mersland-Grasbach syndrome, which is an intrinsic factor receptor deficiency, and this occurs it may occur even in the tubulin part or the amnionless part, and in this case all the other assays of parietal cell function and intestinal absorption are normal. It's only the cobalamin deficiency which sets in infancy. And so also regarding these so genetic causes in infants and children are specific. Then in women of childbearing age, the adherence to a low cobalamin diet during pregnancy may lead to metabolic signs of deficiency in the third trimester. So by in the third trimester, the low cobalamin diet during pregnancy may lead to metabolic signs. So during pregnancy, it's also very late in the third trimester these become manifest. In older people, achlorhydria. In the older people, there is then those defects with the atrophic gastritis and proton pump inhibitors because of all those malabsorption of food that they have, all those gastric complaints that most elderly have. So they are mostly on proton pump inhibitors, and their gastric mucosa may itself be atrophic. So all these causes may lead to achlorhydria, and there could be resultant malabsorption of food-bound cobalamin, and the symptoms may develop slowly. Here also the symptoms will develop slowly because secretion of intrinsic factor all continues, despite the fact that there are the gastric mucosa has become atrophic, or there are proton pump inhibitors inhibiting the action of gastric acid. So therefore the enterohepatic recycling of cobalamin is not affected, and therefore the intrinsic factor, although at a lower rate, may continue to be still secreted. So in elderly and women, the deficiency sets in in women in the third trimester, in elderly also after probably prolonged use of proton pump inhibitors and atrophic gastritis due to or certain malabsorption or low diet. And then and also in those patients with who have poor dentition, also from a very early age, they may be they may also start avoiding meat. So in those elderly also, they are at risk of coalimine deficiency. So women, elderly, and then infants, these are the high risk ages, and the causes are then of course in infants the genetic causes, and then those related to maternal intake. Then in all other causes, malabsorption due to pernicious anemia and medical conditions like not only the gastric causes, gastric secretion of intrinsic factor, but also its absorption in the ileal mucosa. These need to be taken into account. So I think we'll just take a short break here and resume about 2 minutes.